Hello YouTube! I recently read an interesting article by James Shelley called The Problem of Non-Perceptual Art, and I'd like to present this problem here in this video. The problem centres on three propositions which Shelley says are independently plausible but mutually inconsistent. So, proposition R. Artworks necessarily have aesthetic properties that are relevant to their appreciation as artworks. S. Aesthetic properties necessarily depend, at least in part, on properties perceived by means of the senses. And X. There exist artworks that need not be perceived by means of the senses to be appreciated as artworks. So, proposition R says that in appreciating an artwork as an artwork, we appreciate its aesthetic properties. An artwork fails or succeeds in virtue of its aesthetic properties. Later we will examine a little more what exactly counts as an aesthetic property, but just to say a little bit about that now. The aesthetic properties are those that we attend to when we make aesthetic judgments, and we can pick out a number of standard examples. We can speak of an artwork or a natural object as being beautiful, ugly, graceful, elegant, boring, unified, gaudy, vivid, tragic, sad, sombre, chaotic, mysterious, disorganised, monumental, picturesque, grotesque, witty, cliched. Those are some among many aesthetic properties. So I'm not going to give a definition of aesthetic properties, but I'm assuming you have an intuitive grasp of what that is. Consider the aesthetic appreciation of an object, such as a rock, right? So let's say you're on the beach, you pick up a rock, you can appreciate the rock aesthetically, where you attend to its shape, you carefully observe its many colours, you feel its texture and its weight. Compare that with simply using the rock as a paperweight, or studying the material composition of a rock, or applying it as a tool, or whatever. In the former case, right, we are attending to its aesthetic properties. Anyway, according to proposition R, the point of art is to engender aesthetic experiences. This is what is unique about artworks. It is what distinguishes artworks from all other human artifacts. Other things we create may well have positive aesthetic properties, as when a car is sleek and elegant. But that's not their primary function. Cars are designed as vehicles to get you from one place to another. The aesthetic properties, the positive aesthetic properties, are a bonus, but that's not the point. With artworks, the main function, the main point, is to afford aesthetic experience. The audience engages with the aesthetic properties, and the artist will attempt to create works with compelling aesthetic properties. Proposition S says that aesthetic properties depend on properties perceived by the senses. The assumption is that when we experience artworks or other objects aesthetically, we are attending to the observable properties of those objects. Now, of course, there are other ways we might engage with the object. We might ask about its history, how it came into existence, the influence it's had on broader culture, and so on. We might use the object to fulfill a function. So, there's a variety of ways of engaging with any object, but aesthetic experience is based on sensory experience. Again, think of picking up a rock and appreciating it aesthetically. What you focus on will be its observable properties. Proposition X asserts the existence of non-perceptual art. What exactly is non-perceptual art? Well, these are artworks that can be fully appreciated as artworks without being perceived by means of the senses. So Shelley gives these three examples. Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which is an ordinary urinal, exhibited, it's sent to an exhibition and signed R. Mutt. Duchamp's LHOOQ, which is just a photo of the Mona Lisa with a silly moustache drawn on it, and Robert Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing, in which Rauschenberg obtained an artwork by Willem de Kooning, and then he used a variety of techniques to erase as much of it as he could. It took him several months using lots of different techniques to almost completely erase the drawing, so that what you have is basically a blank canvas with a few little specks on it, and you can sort of, that's not obviously a great reproduction, but you can kind of see the remains of a drawing on there if you get a good look. at a good copy of it. Anyway, many other examples of conceptual art could be listed here. So how exactly are these non-perceptual? Well, obviously some sort of perceptual engagement is needed in order for you to know about the artwork in the first place. You might learn about Duchamp's ready-mades by seeing them in a museum, or seeing pictures in a book, or reading descriptions of them, or hearing people talk about them. Or maybe you just learn about them here from this video, right? Obviously there's perceptual content there. Your senses are required to have knowledge of them, but the senses are not required to appreciate them. This is why such pieces are generally classed as conceptual art. It's the idea, not the material object, that is appreciated artistically. So in the case of something like Duchamp's ready-mades, the thought is a description of what he did is adequate. Right? You don't actually need to see these artworks in order to appreciate them fully. It is enough to know that Duchamp took an ordinary urinal, signed it en masse, and then sent it to an art exhibit, right? Similarly, it's enough to know that Duchamp took a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, drew a silly mustache on it, and called it LHOOQ. You also actually need to know that Duchamp was French, and that the letters LHOOQ in French, they sound like the French sentence for she has a hot ass. So the point is that you can appreciate these artworks fully, or at least this is the thought. The thought is you can appreciate these artworks fully just with the propositional knowledge of what these artworks are. You don't actually need to engage with them perceptually. Now, for most artworks, propositional knowledge is not enough. So, I like the work of Mark Rothko. I've never actually seen a Rothko in person. I've got books of Rothko's work which contain very good reproductions, but obviously seeing a smaller copy, that's not the same experience as seeing the original painting. And it's probably quite reasonable for somebody to say, well, look, you've never properly experienced Rothko, because no doubt, if I saw a Rothko in person, I would probably appreciate it even more than I do seeing it in the book. It would be more striking. Its impact on me would be more significant. I might notice things about it that I missed in the reproduction. Seeing the experience of seeing the original would be different in relevant ways. It would, as an artwork, affect me differently. And that doesn't seem to be true for Duchamp's ready-mades. I don't actually need to go to a museum and look at Fountain. If I go and look at Fountain, that's not really going to change my evaluation of it as an artwork. And of course, I might notice different things about it, right? I mean, obviously, if you see the object in person, you're going to notice different things, but they're not really relevant to what Fountain is doing. So those are our three propositions. These three propositions seem to be independently plausible, but clearly they are inconsistent. So let's turn to solutions to this puzzle, denying one of these three propositions. Solution 1 involves affirming R and S and denying X. So we simply deny the existence of non-perceptual art. This is the traditional solution to the puzzle. Now, as Shelley notes, there are two ways we might deny X. First, we could deny that the apparently non-perceptual artworks are artworks at all. Second, we could deny that the apparently non-perceptual artworks are really non-perceptual. So, as an example of the first approach, the denial that apparently non-perceptual artworks are really artworks, Shelley cites Munro Beardsley in Beardsley's article, An Aesthetic Definition of Art. Now, I mean, so this is probably a common enough opinion. Maybe not so much among professionals these days, but among laypersons, it's probably a reasonably common opinion that these supposedly non-perceptual artworks are just not artworks at all, right? Many people will object that pieces like Duchamp's Fountain, they will say, well, look, that's just not art. They will say there's something defective about conceptual art and similar movements. So really there are no examples of artworks that are not perceived by means of the senses. But what's the argument for this? Well, Beardsley's argument on this point is quite simple. He claims, first, that neither Duchamp nor anybody else at the time actually thought of Fountain as an art object. So when Fountain was first created, nobody really thought that it was a piece of art. Now, as a purely historical point, that doesn't seem to be true. There were people at the time who took Fountain to be an artwork, but I mean, like, maybe at a stretch, we might interpret the situation along the lines that Beardsley suggests. Duchamp may have been playing a joke on the art establishment or something like that. And of course, the Dadaist tradition with which he was associated was explicitly anti-art, aiming to create objects that reject previous conceptions of art. So, maybe they're not really making what they conceive of as art, maybe. Furthermore, it's certainly true that the board for the Society of Independent Artists, who were running the exhibition to which Fountain was first submitted, they suppressed the piece and refused to display it. They said that though, and I quote, it may be a very useful object in its place is not an art exhibition, and it is by no definition a work of art. So the people running the exhibition did not consider it a work of art, or at least most of them didn't consider it a work of art. Actually, the vote to suppress the piece was won by a narrow margin, so maybe some of them did consider it a work of art, but most of them didn't. Second, Beardsley claims that Duchamp did not, and I quote, inaugurate a tradition that led to the acceptance of plumbing figures or other ready-mades as artworks today. So we continue to use urinals as just urinals, not as artworks. So, I mean, basically, Beardsley's argument is that nobody at the time took urinals to be artworks, and nobody since then has taken urinals to be artworks either. Right? The art world does not recognise urinals as artworks. Now, the obvious problem with this line of argument, as Shelley notes, is it's just obviously false. Yeah, Duchamp did not initiate a tradition of regarding urinals as artworks, but he did initiate a tradition of regarding ready-mades as artworks. So there is an artistic tradition of taking an object, right, like a found object, an object that has been made for some other purpose, and then recontextualizing it and thereby turning it into an artwork. Duchamp certainly did initiate a tradition of that. Now, you may not like that. You may object that ready-mades ought not to be considered artworks, but it's just a straightforward fact about the institutions of the art world that within those institutions, ready-mades are generally considered to be artworks. And, not just ready-mades, we have a long tradition of a variety of other forms of conceptual art as well. So Fountain and many other non-perceptual artworks are considered artworks. And indeed, some of them have been extremely influential. Some of them are considered classics of 20th century art. So if we're appealing to the traditions of the art world to determine what does and does not count as art, it's going to be very difficult to deny that apparently non-perceptual artworks are artworks. But there is another way we might take the line of argument that Beardsley suggests. Instead of using the opinions and traditions of the art world to define what counts as art, maybe we should use the opinions and traditions of laypersons. Maybe we think of the art world and the art institutions as being stuffy and elitist and out of touch with the common man. And so, the relevant conventions and opinions are those of laypersons, and then the claim will be that lay people, the common man, right, those people do not recognise Fountain as an artwork. That doesn't seem to be the argument that Beardsley himself proposes, but it's one that might be made. Again, there are a couple of problems with this move. First, there are plenty of laypersons who actually do engage with conceptual art and do find value in works like Fountain. I know this because I myself am a layperson with respect to the arts. I'm not an artist, but I find value in work. I think Fountain is brilliant, so I find value in this stuff, and I've communicated with many other people who are similarly laypersons with respect to the arts who find value in such works. The notion that it's only the stuffy, pretentious elitists who can appreciate conceptual art is just obviously wrong. Second point, though, is it's worth noting that while it's true that there are many people who claim that Fountain is not art, they might be using the term art in an evaluative sense. So we sometimes use this word, the word art, to express a positive evaluation. We say that something is art when it is a particularly good example of the field. So on this usage, right, there can't be bad art, right? The term art is necessarily an expression of positive evaluation, so there can't be art that does not involve a great deal of skill and craftsmanship. Now, obviously, that's not how we're using the term here, right? For the purposes of this video, we're using the term art in the broader, non-evaluative sense, to just cover those things that, to cover both good and bad art, both art that involves skill and craftsmanship and art that is, thrown together in 5 minutes. That's worth bearing in mind. When somebody looks at something like Fountain and says, that's not art, they might really be saying that's crap. Okay then. So the first option does not look like a particularly promising line of argument. What about the second option? So the second option is to deny that apparently non-perceptual artworks are really non-perceptual. So Shelley cites George Dickey in George Dickey's article Art and the Aesthetic as an example of this position. According to Dickey, whenever we appreciate an artwork, we appreciate its perceptual properties. With respect to Duchamp's Fountain, Dickey says, we may appreciate, and I quote, its gleaming white surface, the depth revealed when it reflects images of surrounding objects, and its pleasing oval shape. So really, these artworks like Fountain do have perceptual properties, and that's what we're responding to. Yeah, again, this seems kind of implausible. So in response, Shelley grants that, of course, Fountain can be appreciated for its perceptual properties, right? We might appreciate the perceptual properties of any object that can be perceived, but to appreciate Fountain for these qualities is to miss the point. It's to fail to engage with it properly as a work of art. The perceptual properties of Fountain, the gleaming white surface and the pleasing oval shape, those are not actually all that important to its status as an artwork. After all, Fountain is perceptually indistinguishable from any other urinal. We can imagine, a worker at some art gallery accidentally leaving a urinal on an art stand instead of intentionally putting it there, and that might be totally indistinguishable from Fountain. And yet, Fountain has properties that are not shared by these other urinals. Shelley quotes Arthur Danto. So, Fountain, Danto says, is daring, impudent, irreverent, witty, and clever. And notice that even the people who object to Fountain, who insist that, that the kind of people who look at Fountain and be like, that's not art, even those people will probably recognise that it does have these kinds of distinguishing properties. Because otherwise they would probably never have felt moved to comment on it in the first place. There are certain things that distinguish Fountain. These distinguishing properties must be non-perceptual because Fountain is perceptually indistinguishable from other urinals. But it's precisely these properties, it's precisely these distinguishing properties that make Fountain an artwork and that are relevant to its appreciation as an artwork. Similar points hold for the other allegedly non-perceptual artworks. LHOOQ is just a reproduction of the Mona Lisa with a silly moustache added. To appreciate that for its perceptual properties, we would have to assume that the point of the piece is the beauty with which the moustache is rendered, the beauty it adds to the painting, or something like that. That's a very strained interpretation of that piece. The point is to talk of the perceptual properties of works like Fountain and LHOOQ. It seems almost like a joke, right? You're completely missing the point of the works and the ways in which people have engaged with them in the decades since they were made. What matters with something like LHOOQ is the fact that a silly moustache was added to the Mona Lisa. What matters to our appreciation of it as an artwork is knowledge of this propositional fact. There's something kind of funny, right, about somebody looking at Fountain and responding the way Dickey does, right, talking about its gleaming white surface and its pleasing oval shape. That's how much it seems to miss the point. Okay, so we might worry, though, it might be responded that Shelley moves too quickly here. Consider again LHOOQ. Well, it would surely be ridiculous to talk about the elegance and beauty with which Duchamp has drawn the moustache, the way in which the moustache complements the contours of the face, and so on. But notice the moustache is silly. Now, silliness is an aesthetic property. Remember, aesthetic properties need not be, they need not be beautiful. They need not be positive, ugly, gaudy, cliched. Those are all aesthetic properties, and indeed silly. Right? Silliness is an aesthetic property. It's also worth noting that Duchamp took a great deal of care in selecting the objects to present as ready-mades. He didn't just randomly pick out anything. That might suggest that the perceptual properties of the objects mattered. If any common item would have sufficed, why not just choose anything? Of course, I suppose the urinal in Fountain also has the benefit of tastelessness, but that's not the case for some of the other objects selected as ready-mades by Duchamp. So he had a bicycle wheel and he had a shovel, and he took some care in choosing these. So maybe that would suggest that actually no, it's like the object itself, the perceptual properties, the observable properties really do matter for that. So we might respond in that kind of way, but it seems to me that we can probably bypass this whole debate because there are other examples of artworks where it's much less plausible to attribute aesthetic properties to the observable features. So a good example might be Piero Manzoni's Base of the World, which consists simply of an upside-down plinth. Now, we may appreciate the aesthetic properties of the plinth, but the plinth itself is clearly not what's important. This is a classic case of conceptual art. So essentially, he's taken a plinth, turned it upside down, called it the base of the world, so it's kind of reframing the whole planet as a piece of art. He could have used any other base, anything else as a plinth, and the work would make the same point, right? Turning the earth itself into an art object. Now, of course, when we contemplate this artwork, you don't do that by appreciating the aesthetic properties of the earth, right? It's not like you sort of are appreciating the aesthetic properties of the landscape in which the plinth is placed. It's the idea of turning the whole planet into an art object, the idea of putting the earth on a plinth. That's what matters. So in general, it seems clear that part of what we appreciate when we appreciate something like Fountain as an artwork are its non-perceptual properties. Indeed, it is in virtue of such non-perceptual properties that Fountain has had such a significant influence. If people were just looking at its gleaming white surface and pleasing oval shape, it would never have generated so much controversy. It would never have influenced whole generations of artists. So the perceptual properties seem to be incidental. I mean, a more general point of all of this is, when we engage with artworks, we care about more than just appearances. We also care about, what they mean. We care about the ideas associated with them. We will think, okay, what's the message of this artwork? How does it relate to other artworks? What's its place in broader culture? Right? What are the ideas being communicated by the piece? And so on. This cognitive engagement is an important aspect of our engagement with art. And the thought is going to be, well, some artworks can be focused almost entirely on that cognitive engagement, right? Like if you acknowledge, right, that when you engage with an artwork, that there is the kind of sensuous engagement where you're just struck by its perceptual properties, and then there's the cognitive engagement where you think about the ideas, right? Once you accept that there are these two ways that we might engage with art, why shouldn't there be artworks that are focused basically entirely on the cognitive engagement? And those would be non-perceptual artworks. Okay then, so that's the first solution and some of the problems with it. Time to turn to the second solution. The second solution to our puzzle is to deny R. That is, deny that artworks necessarily have aesthetic properties that are relevant to their appreciation as artworks. So there can be some artworks without aesthetic properties. On this view, we we can affirm that aesthetic properties do depend on properties perceived by means of the senses, and that there are artworks that need not be perceived by means of the senses to be appreciated. So some artworks are non-aesthetic. The appreciation of such art does not depend on its aesthetic properties. Now, according to Shelley, this is currently the standard solution to the puzzle. Before, like traditionally, the standard solution would have just been to deny that there are non-perceptual artworks, but these days, and actually not just these days, but for the last century, the standard solution has been to deny that artworks necessarily have aesthetic properties relevant to their status as art. Most philosophers of art, according to Shelley, will hold that non-perceptual artworks are thereby non-aesthetic artworks. They are appreciated for something other than their aesthetic properties. So one way we might try to defend the idea of non-aesthetic artworks is by finding uncontroversial cases of such artworks. This is the line taken by Noel Carroll in his response to Shelley, his article, Non-Perceptual Aesthetic Properties. Carroll first suggests that there are artworks which simply don't have aesthetic properties. These artworks are formless, or they fail to realise their purpose, or they fail to strike us emotionally. There are many examples of such artworks because we can find them in bad art. Bad art is still art, and any theory of art needs to accommodate the existence of bad art. So it seems that for Carroll, what distinguishes bad art is its failure to exhibit aesthetic properties. The artist may intend to display pleasing aesthetic properties, and the audience may search for such properties, but the artist simply fails to achieve her aim. Now, I must say, I don't find the appeal to bad art particularly persuasive, primarily because my own intuition is that, well, surely bad art does have aesthetic properties. Indeed, my thought would be that bad art is bad precisely in virtue of its bad aesthetic properties. As we noted earlier, aesthetic properties don't need to be positive. Indeed, Carroll actually grants this himself elsewhere in his article. So he says, and I quote, "Surely the sloppy asymmetries in a work that aspires to geometric clarity and that is displeasing precisely for its failure to do so are aesthetic properties. Whatever else could these blemishes be?" Well, I would have thought Carroll is right about that. The notion of the aesthetic should not be a laudatory one. Just as we have to accommodate both good art and bad art, it looks like we need to accommodate both good and bad aesthetic properties. Well, then we can say that what distinguishes bad art is not that it fails to exhibit aesthetic properties, but that its aesthetic properties are displeasing, or of low value, or whatever. Now, I mean, this is not to say that there can't be bad art without aesthetic properties. Maybe there is some art which just fails to have aesthetic properties and is bad in virtue of this, but I don't know, there are no obvious examples that come to mind, at least to me. So, second example given by Carroll. He says there are many artworks that are recognised as art and yet are not even intended to support contemplation of aesthetic properties, or at least that's not the point of the work. So, in these cases, the work may have aesthetic properties, but the aesthetic properties are incidental, so neither the artist nor the audience is primarily interested in the aesthetic properties. Political and religious artworks may be of this nature. We can, of course, appreciate the aesthetic properties of a piece of political propaganda, but that's not the point of the work. The point of the work is to achieve some social end, maybe to promote allegiance to the state, perhaps. Again, this example doesn't strike me as particularly persuasive. So yes, a propaganda film is intended primarily for political purposes, but it achieves its goals in a way, or rather it achieves its goals by being engaging, entertaining, striking, dynamic, emotionally moving, and so on. Right? These are aesthetic properties. So, this is precisely the point of creating an artwork, of, say, making a film, rather than just writing out an academic argument. The aesthetic properties of the piece play a key role in how it achieves its propaganda effect. It is precisely by moving the audience, by creating something that thrills them, that you sway the audience to your cause. Propaganda does not argue, it converts, and conversion is achieved with aesthetic properties, or so it seems to me. So, somebody who is inclined to think that artworks have aesthetic properties relevant to their appreciation as artworks probably shouldn't be moved by the existence of propaganda art. But final example Carroll gives is that of tribal artifacts. These we take to be artworks, but they were originally not intended to be any kind of art. Instead, they were used to frighten off onlookers, or perhaps they were used as tools in the worship of gods or whatever. They had a purely utilitarian function. Today, we appreciate the aesthetic properties of such works, but that's not why they were made, and that's not why they were used by their original audiences. And so I think we can grant, for the sake of argument, that this claim is true, right? Now, this is somewhat problematic, because for any given tribal artifact, we might well be incorrect about why exactly it was created. I mean, especially if you're talking about something that's been dug up by archaeologists or something. But yeah, there probably are tribal artifacts that are of this nature, where today we take them as artworks and we evaluate them as artworks, but they were initially just intended for some utilitarian purpose. But the response to this case seems obvious, and it's actually noted by Carroll himself. What we should say is that these objects were not artworks when they were created, but became artworks later, when they were adopted by art world institutions and used as opportunities for affording aesthetic experiences. Similarly, we might imagine archaeologists of the future discovering plumbing pipes and then placing them in museums where they're appreciated as artworks. Obviously, the pipes are not artworks right now. They become artworks once they're in the museums and people appreciate them. And I use the plumbing pipe example to suggest an analogy to Duchamp's fountain, because we might think of the tribal artifacts noted by Carroll as being among the first ready-mades. Just as Duchamp turned an ordinary urinal into an artwork by placing it within the right context in the art world, we've long been doing the same thing with many tribal artifacts. Okay then, so defending the claim that there is non-aesthetic art, that there are artworks that are not intended to be appreciated for their aesthetic properties, defending that claim by appealing to these kinds of specific cases may not be a promising strategy. I mean, part of the problem here, actually, is that we don't really have a clear understanding of what counts as an aesthetic property. So, compare this with establishing that something is non-perceptual. Well, we know pretty straightforwardly what counts as perception, and that allows us to specify pretty straightforwardly what counts as a perceptual property. But what counts as an aesthetic property? This is a difficult matter. So look, if we accept that there is non-perceptual art, then we must either deny R and say that there is non-aesthetic art, or we deny S and say that aesthetic properties can be non-perceptual. Clearly, the debate here between those who deny R and those who deny S, this debate rests on what exactly counts as an aesthetic property. But that's very much in contention. Furthermore, it's not at all clear that any of the standard views of what counts as an aesthetic property actually tell us one way or the other whether aesthetic properties are necessarily perceptual. One view, for example, is that aesthetic properties are properties that we take pleasure in for their own sake. Recall the example of appreciating the rock as an aesthetic object. In this case, we're not using the rock to fulfill some other function, we are just attending to and appreciating the properties of the rock. But that doesn't in itself entail that aesthetic properties must be perceptual properties, because we can attend to the non-perceptual properties for their own sake as well. Gerald Levinson, in his introductory chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Aesthetics, lists a number of hallmarks of aesthetic properties. So I'll just quickly quote the list. He says, hallmarks of aesthetic properties are having gestalt character, requiring taste for discernment, having an evaluative aspect, affording pleasure or displeasure in mere contemplation, being non-condition governed, being emergent on lower level perceptual properties, requiring imagination for attribution, requiring metaphorical thought for attribution, being notably a focus of aesthetic experience, being notably present in works of art. Now, Levinson does say that it's widely agreed that aesthetic properties are perceptual properties, and in the list I just read out, obviously being emergent on lower level perceptual properties would fit that. But it looks like none of the other features on this list in themselves imply that aesthetic properties must be perceptual properties. There's no obvious reason here why aesthetic properties would have to be perceptual. Appealing to a general theory, let's say, of what aesthetic properties are, in order to defend the claim that there can be non-aesthetic art, maybe isn't promising. As a final argument, then, it might be suggested that however we ultimately define aesthetic properties, we can see from how we discuss aesthetic properties, how we use this concept, the concept of the aesthetic, that aesthetic properties must be perceptual. The thought is appreciating aesthetic properties depends on a kind of direct acquaintance with them that requires perception. So consider listening to a piece of music. Let's say this music is serene. Well, I can't simply be told that the music is serene in order to appreciate this. I have to hear it, feel it for myself, right? In order to have a proper appreciation for that. Suppose we're having a conversation about the song, okay? I tell you that the song is 5 minutes long. How do I know this? Well, I read it in a book. I've never listened to the song myself, okay? But I just read in a book about various songs that this particular song is 5 minutes long. Well, you'd probably accept that as being reasonable testimony. You may not believe me, but what I've said is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, even if you continue to suspend judgment about it. But now consider this case. I tell you that the song is serene, elegant, moving. How do I know this? Well, again, I say, because I read it in a piece written by a music critic. I've never actually listened to the song myself. Now, you're not going to take my testimony very seriously here. With aesthetic properties, we can't simply defer to others in the same kind of way as we can with propositional knowledge. Rather, we have to experience the relevant aesthetic properties ourselves. So, aesthetic judgments cannot, or at least should not, be made without aesthetic perception. This is just to say, or the argument will go, this is just to say that aesthetic properties must be perceivable. So non-perceptual art must be non-aesthetic art. And now this is not to deny that we can infer aesthetic properties from the testimony of others. If a critic describes a piece of music as serene, and I trust the critic, then maybe I'll infer that the music is serene, or at least that if I were to listen to the music, then it would strike me as serene. But I certainly can't appreciate this properly without perceiving it myself. So what I'm inferring when I infer that the music is serene is the presence of certain perceptual properties. Similarly, Shelley notes, a colourblind man may infer that something is green without himself seeing the green. He is, in that case, he's still inferring a perceptual property, and of course he can't really appreciate or understand the greenness without seeing it. You need that perceptual engagement. Is this argument convincing? Well, it's not clear that there's really a distinction between perceptual and non-perceptual art in this respect. Suppose that we are talking about Duchamp's Fountain. I say that Fountain was first exhibited in 1917, and I know this because I just read about it in a book. I don't actually know anything else about Fountain. I don't know what Duchamp did. For all I know, maybe it was a painting, or maybe it was a composition, a song. All I know is, from this book, that this guy called Marcel Duchamp made a piece called Fountain and exhibited it in 1917. Again, you'd accept this as reasonable testimony. On the other hand, suppose I tell you that Fountain is witty and impish. Why do I think it's witty and impish? Well, because an art critic whose, let's say, his tastes tend to align with my own, describes it as witty and impish. I don't know anything about Fountain. I don't know anything at all other than the name. But hey, the critic says it's witty and impish, and I'll go with that. Well, this kind of seems absurd, right? So what these cases suggest is there's a sense in which aesthetic judgments can't be deferred to others. When we attribute aesthetic properties to an artwork, we need to have direct acquaintance with the features of the artwork that ground the aesthetic properties. But this doesn't show that those features need to be perceptual. So you need to perceive the song to attribute serenity to it, but that's because serenity is grounded by perceptual features. You don't need to perceive fountain in order to attribute wittiness and impishness to it, because the argument will go, well, these are aesthetic properties, but they're not grounded by perceptual features. You need to conceive of fountain to attribute wittiness and impishness to it. In both cases, you can't defer to others, so you need to perceive the song and you need to conceive of fountain, rather than just deferring to the judgments of others. This doesn't seem like a successful argument, or at least, there's the response, right, to this argument that there can be non-aesthetic art. Okay then, if we can't find a reason to believe that there is non-aesthetic art, that leaves us with the third solution, which is to deny S. So we affirm R, we affirm that artworks necessarily have aesthetic properties relevant to their appreciation as artworks. What makes something an artwork are its aesthetic properties. We affirm X, that there are non-perceptual artworks. So some aesthetic properties must be non-perceptual properties. Some aesthetic properties do not necessarily depend on properties perceived by the senses. Now, according to Shelley, this option is the least popular, which surprised me somewhat because, frankly, this struck me as the obvious solution, but apparently very few philosophers of art accept it. So we can give a fairly straightforward argument for this position using the cases of non-perceptual artworks. Here's the argument. Fountain is impish. Fountain is perceptually indistinguishable from an ordinary urinal. An ordinary urinal is not impish. Impishness is, or at least can be, an aesthetic property. Therefore, not all aesthetic properties are perceptual properties. And of course, this argument can be repeated for many other artworks. You just replace impish and impishness with the relevant properties. Indeed, as Shelley notes, there is a significant type of artwork that is non-perceptual, but that most people take to have aesthetic properties, namely literature. If aesthetic properties depend on properties perceived by means of the senses, then literary works do not have aesthetic properties, at least not in their normal use. Of course, a book might be well made, it might be constructed so that as a physical object it has interesting or pleasing properties. It might use a special type of paper or interesting design for the text or have an interesting cover. Occasionally there are even novels which explicitly use perceptual properties as part of the artwork, so using a special typeface when writing a scene in which a character is hallucinating. But the basic function of a novel is to tell a story, and telling a story is purely conceptual. You can tell a story entirely in your own head. You don't need a physical object there at all. So for most books, the text is simply a means for communicating the relevant concepts. Yes, we perceive the words in the book, but the words in the book are the means of communicating the literary work, not the work. They're not the work itself. So if stories have aesthetic properties, and it looks like they do, then aesthetic properties need not be perceptual properties. What might we say in response to this example? Well, here's one line we might take. Fictional worlds are imagined concreta. They are imagined concrete objects. Fictional worlds are the kind of things that would have perceptual properties if they were to exist. When you read a book, you will imagine things along with it. I mean, reading a book is maybe like viewing a film inside one's own head. Rather, it's not like sitting down and watching a film, but you create a film in your head to correspond to the story you're reading. So maybe we can make this kind of move. Maybe we can say, okay, aesthetic properties are perceptual properties, but what we evaluate when we evaluate a story are not its aesthetic properties, because it doesn't really have any aesthetic properties as a story, but rather the imagined aesthetic properties, the aesthetic properties that we imagine when we interpret the work correctly. So there are certain aesthetic properties that a story will prescribe us to imagine, and that's what we're evaluating. In the same kind of way, we can discuss the moral properties of a fictional world. We can ask, are the actions of this particular character morally justified? Well, in making such judgments, we're not discussing actual actions and actual moral properties, but the imagined actions and imagined moral properties. So maybe we can say the same thing about aesthetic properties. What we evaluate when we evaluate these artworks are imagined aesthetic properties. So this is a possible move. It would need to be developed with some care, though. So one question here is, what exactly are these imagined aesthetic properties attaching to? We need to distinguish between a story and the fictional world that a story is about, because we speak of both of these things as having aesthetic properties. A fictional landscape, I might say, is beautiful, right? So I can say that a fictional landscape is beautiful, or I can say that the description of a fictional landscape is beautiful. Now, in calling a fictional landscape beautiful, I'm imagining the beauty, because a fictional landscape doesn't really have any properties at all, right? Like it's fictional. It doesn't really exist. So I'm imagining a landscape with various properties. I'm imagining trees and fields and sunshine and all of these things in various kinds of colours, and I'm imagining it such that it is beautiful to me. So the beauty is imagined when I'm imagining a fictional landscape. But then a description of a fictional landscape, when I say that the description of a fictional landscape is beautiful, I'm not imagining the beauty there. I read the description and I just I'm responding to it as a real thing. The description is real and I'm calling it beautiful. There's no act of imagination going on here. I mean, so one way to see this is that you could have a really ugly description of a beautiful fictional landscape, right? Like, I mean, you could just write in a book, some place, right? Like, I don't know, this field in such and such place is beautiful, right? So this is a fictional field, and I've attributed the property of beauty to it within the fictional world, right? So, but that's not a very good description. If I just write such and such is a beautiful field, that's a really lame description. That's not beautiful. So the artwork there, the story is not beautiful, but I am prescribing you to imagine a beautiful landscape. So the problem with appealing to imagined aesthetic properties is going to be in accommodating this distinction. It looks like the imagined aesthetic properties are attributed to the fictional world, but actual aesthetic properties are attributed to the story that is about the fictional world, to the story that it prescribes us to imagine this fictional world. That's my intuition, at least. And if that's right, then it's not obvious how postulating imagined aesthetic properties is supposed to work. In any case, there are further examples of aesthetic evaluation where postulating imagined properties really isn't going to help. In particular, we also speak of the aesthetic properties of, for instance, scientific laws and mathematical theorems. If you want more on this particular point, you might want to check out my video, Beauty in Science. So anyway, this was recognised as far back as Hutcheson in his inquiry concerning beauty, order, harmony, design. Hutcheson cites the beauty of Euclid's geometry and of Newton's gravitational principle. In cases like this, it's hard to see what the imagined concrete objects might be. How could empirical laws and mathematical theorems have perceptual properties, even imagined perceptual properties? Now, I suppose we can imagine concrete objects behaving in accordance with these laws and theorems, but that misses a big part of what makes these laws beautiful, that the beauty is precisely in their abstraction, their symmetry, their unifying power. Those are the things that we are responding to, and those are, well, they're abstract properties. They're not they're not perceptual. So, yeah, I mean, at the very least, to suppose that we find beauty in laws and theorems by considering how they are instantiated in concrete objects, that would, I think, be quite strained. Okay, then. In favour of the third solution, then, one argument here is it looks like there are lots of cases of things that are non-perceptual, but that we still attribute aesthetic properties to them. Literature and things like scientific laws and mathematical theorems. A final argument in favour of the third solution, raised by Shelley, is what we might call the argument from corresponding roles. So, Shelley's idea is, look, there are various non-perceptual properties that strike us in much the same way as perceptual properties do. We can respond emotionally, not just to perceptual objects, but also to conceptions, to things that we merely hold in our minds. Aesthetic experiences can be provoked by many things, both perceptual and non-perceptual, and the key idea is that the non-perceptual properties play the same role with respect to non-perceptual art as aesthetic properties do with respect to perceptual art. Shelley elaborates on the argument in this way. Let's take an example of supposedly non-aesthetic art, say fountain. Now, if our appreciation of fountain does not depend on its aesthetic properties, well, our appreciation must depend on some other class of properties, right? Non-aesthetic properties. So one of these apparently non-aesthetic properties is impishness, right? Let's say that one of the things that we appreciate when we appreciate fountain is its impishness. Okay, so the claim is that impishness is going to be a non-aesthetic property. But it would appear that the role played by impishness in our appreciation of fountain corresponds very closely to the role played by aesthetic properties in our appreciation of perceptual artworks. So impishness stands to fountain as aesthetic properties stand to perceptual artworks. Shelley contrasts fountain with the slow movement of Mozart's 39th Symphony. This movement, he says, has the aesthetic properties of elegance and grace. So let's think about the role played by elegance and grace. Well, the elegance and grace of the movement is why the movement moves the audience, why the movement strikes the audience and makes them feel something. So it's the elegance of this symphony that provokes a reaction in the audience, right? That's why the audience has this reaction. So we can tell this psychological story, connecting this aesthetic property to the reaction of the audience. But similarly, we could say the same thing about fountain. The impishness of fountain is why fountain moves us. Maybe it moves some people to anger, but like it or hate it, it's part of what you're responding to is its impishness, right? Second, if you fail to perceive the elegance and grace of Mozart's symphony, you fail to properly appreciate it as an artwork. Mozart aimed to achieve the aesthetic properties of elegance and grace. Well, similarly, if you fail to detect the impishness of fountain, you fail to properly appreciate it as an artwork. Duchamp aimed to imbue the artwork with the property of impishness. Third, the artistic merit of Mozart's symphony lies in its aesthetic properties of elegance and grace. The aesthetic properties are what ground our judgment that it is good. When we judge that this is a valuable artwork, part of the reason why is because of this property of elegance. Similarly, the artistic merit of fountain lies in its impishness, not in any of its perceptual properties, right? The impishness is what makes it good. When I'm saying that fountain is good, part of the reason why is because of its impishness. That is the reason I would cite for why it has artistic merit. Finally, when we engage with Mozart's symphony, we enjoy the elegance and grace for their own sake. The contemplation of these aesthetic properties is pleasurable in itself. Similarly, when we engage with Duchamp's fountain, we enjoy the impishness for its own sake. The contemplation of impishness is pleasurable in itself. So, in all of these ways, the impishness stands to fountain as elegance and grace stand to Mozart's symphony. In which case, what are the grounds for denying that impishness is an aesthetic property? Right? What's the relevant difference? It looks so impishness seems to be playing the role of an aesthetic property. So why not just call it an aesthetic property? That is Shelley's suggestion. Okay then, that's all. That's all for this video. I hope you found that interesting, and yeah, goodbye.